focus is lives in the battlefield. And they're worried that all these efficiency measures, right, will hamper their operations and their goals. Okay. Secondly, culture of energy efficiency is nascent in the military. They've never really had to think about things like turning off the lights when they leave a room, right, or not running an 8-mile-per-gallon Humvee across base, right? Adam Siegel, he's a long-time expert on U.S. military and energy security, has said at an energy conference with the Navy, quote, "We will know there's a real change in the culture when a sergeant yells at a private for leaving a light on in the tent, the same way he does to put a cigarette out in the foxhole." Right? So this kind of mentality. All right? When did we start realizing we shouldn't hold ourselves up in a room with cigarette smokers? It wasn't that long ago, right? As one journalist put it, who spent some time in Afghanistan, quote, "Because of waste, poor installation, inefficiency, redundancy, fully 90% of electricity the military produces for the base is wasted. It's one of the reasons why the U.S. military is spending $100,000 a person annually on fuel." A person. So my second observation on whether the U.S. military is meeting its goals is what critics say. Critics say that the military has placed too much hope in the science of biofuels, especially the scalable aspect of biofuels. There was a RAND study just released a couple months ago, Alternative Fuels for Military Application. It had a very benign title. It had a very critical assessment of particularly the U.S. Navy's efforts in biofuels. The RAND study found that the military would be, and by the way, this study is funded by the Office of Secretary of Defense, right? RAND, 95% of RAND's funding is congressionally marked, and most of it is from the Department of Defense. Experts from RAND found that the military would be better off to focus on efficiency from an environmental and economic perspective rather than biofuels. So look at efficiency and look at economics and not biofuels. And RAND's view is that the benefit of this effort and the costs that will be incurred to meet the goal may in the long run be more than it costs to reach the goal. So getting there will cost too much, basically. Another challenge is the whole land issue, right, that we all face, that we know, we're familiar with in ethanol. So it's that environmental benefits of biofuels are highly uncertain, number one, and number two, in particular, pursuing fuels from seed oils would take up valuable land, right? So these are all, and it was interesting because after this report came out, I saw Mabus speak the second time, Secretary Mabus, and this time he said, we want biofuels if it doesn't interfere with land use. So he specifically said that. Okay, so the third observation is procurements, and I have 3 of them up here, are still, this month, procurements are heavily oil intensive, right? So March 17th, 2011, announcement that the U.S. Navy will buy more Littoral combat ships. And they actually use more fuel than guided missile frigates they were replacing. And the U.S. Navy also is buying more of the P-8A Poseidon, there in the right-hand corner, to replace the P-3 Orion, which is the Navy's kind of frontline land-based maritime patrol aircraft since the 1960s, basically. And the Poseidon actually burns more fuel, carries less, and can't last as long as its predecessor. I'm getting this from open source, all available in the media. There's a lot of defense bloggers and experts and industry experts, and there's loads of information out there. And just this past February, the Obama administration, so you can blame past administrations maybe on this stuff, right? I mean, you know, acquisition and timelines are very long. But just this past February, the Obama administration supported the purchase of this, the Boeing tanker, the Air Force's next generation mid-air refueling aircraft, instead of the EATS plane, which is a European plane, but they were going to make it in, I think, Augusta, Georgia, or Alabama, one of the 2 states. While the Eads plane is arguably bigger, which was Gates' argument, Secretary of Defense Gates' argument, it's actually known that the Eads plane, rather than the Boeing, delivers more fuel to the warfighter at one time and burns less fuel per hour getting there. Right? So it's a mixed record, right? We could argue that it will just take time getting there. So my three conclusions then are energy security for the U.S. military is about cost, combat, and climate. The U.S. military is moving out on strategy, policy, directives, technology, and demonstrations, but they're still challenged by culture, concerns of combat effectiveness, and current limits of renewable energies. What I would say, though, is it's pretty amazing how they're leading the government in this transformative process. Right? There aren't other agencies that are quite out there in and outside the government. They are attempting to break oil dependence. I mean, they've made it the mission, the vision. And they're addressing this nexus of energy security and environmental sustainability while attempting to ensure combat effectiveness. It's hard to do all this while you're in 2 active wars, 1.5, however you want to measure it, 1 3/4 if you include Libya, right? It's hard to do this stuff while you've got that stress. And in many ways, the U.S. military has led similar challenges in the past. Why put faith in the U.S. military to drive the energy revolution in the United States, right? Well, as Ray Mabus, Secretary of the Navy, likes to say, the Navy's been innovating in energy sources since the 1950s, right? In the 1950s, they moved to coal. Then oil in the early 20th century, then nuclear in the 1950s, and now biofuels. And every time, he says, there were naysayers, and every time they were wrong. Right, so he likes to say that. And he also likes to say that the Navy can create markets. We've got 3.3 million acres of land, 72,500 buildings. We've got one of the most advanced R&D test beds in the world. So if you can't do it here, where can you do it? Right, basically. And finally, I would remind you that the internet, GPS, flat-screen TVs, all started in the military, moved out to broader commercial base. Perhaps they can do the same thing for energy. So I'll end it. I hope we have enough time for some questions or discussion. Thank you. Yes?
Has anybody talked about, at least you said you worked in the Department of Defense for a few years, like, I was in the Army for 6.5 years, and there's a whole lot of training that went on, because I worked in aviation. Helicopters eat up a lot of fuel. So, like, is there any talk of actually, like, cutting down on unnecessarily training events and stuff like that? Because that would greatly reduce consumption without any capital outlier.
That's a good point. Well, that's going to be your operation guys, your combat effectiveness is affected. But I don't know. I'll look into that. That's an interesting question. Right. Yeah.
So now that you've identified some of the things, is there going to be like a solutions process to where you try to address some of these issues with actual proactive?
Me personally?
Yes. Or is there, is there a council that you can address?
Well, I'm actually saying the obvious. I mean, what I think is it's all things American. Some of it's going to be up to the markets. But I can tell you from having attended the MIT Energy Club conference, the 2-day conference, I came away very optimistic because people are making a lot of money in trying to transition the United States military. I mean, people who were on the outskirts of the United States working on growing tall corn in dry climates for fuel are now getting huge grants from the Department of Defense. And entrepreneurs and scientists are marrying up, right? So you go to MIT, you go to the research laboratories, you're an entrepreneur. They're working on the next battery, the next storage capability. So I think it's going to be one of those things where the confluence of